Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I just realized that I'm gonna have to move this back up again for Nathaniel, but for now it's down. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Nathaniel Deutsch. I'm so excited that he's here. And I'll just say that he gave us 3 choices of talks. Do you remember 3 titles? And one of them had the Borough Park in it. When Borough Park was a red state, is that the title? I think it is. And I'll just say I grew up in Borough Park, so we basically hired an expert to come explain my childhood to me. So, and you guys all get to listen. Though when I was a kid, it was a blue state. I actually was, this snippet of a song just popped into my head a minute ago. Yum, Nixon is a bum. Yum. So apparently Nixon was a bum, but Trump is an angel. So anyway, but this is to introduce Nathaniel, who I now back to me again, who I met in the YIVO summer program. So I'm saying that partly because we have all these Yiddishists here. So this is what happens when you go to the YIVO program, like, 25 years later, you're running the world, basically. And that's who Nathaniel is. He's running the world. He's the Baumgarten Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies. And I think he's also, I'm trying to see where it is. This is like a super long CV, help. And I only have the first 3 pages. You're the director of the Humanities Center at University of California at Santa Cruz for many years, right? So there's that. And also he's written 7 books. I'll just say that he has the kind of modesty and humility of somebody who's only written like maybe 5. So his books are, the most recent one is, and a lot of, oh, here it is. Okay, and before that he was at Schwartzmore, at the Jewish College of Schwartzmore. Sorry, I'm really screwing up this introduction. I'm just going to name a few of my favorite books, and I've read a few of them. A Fortress in Brooklyn just came out. It's Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg, which was published with Michael Casper, who was a student of mine too. That came out in 2021. And before that, also 2021, I don't know how you do that, but okay. The Lost World of Russia's Jews, Ethnography and Folklore in the Pale of Settlement, which is really a major contribution. Translation of Ansky's ethnographic survey. And the survey itself is so fascinating. The Jewish Dark Continent, which is also about Ansky. Are those both about Ansky? So Life and Death in the Russian Pale of Settlement. This one I haven't read, but it sounds really interesting. Inventing America's Worst Family, Eugenics, Islam, and the Rise and Fall of the Tribe of Ishmael, 2009. The Maid of Ludmir, which I have read, A Jewish Holy Woman and Her World. And then 2 others that go way back to the beginning of his career when he was a scholar of Merkava mysticism, Guardians of the Gate and the Gnostic Imagination. And I see 2 Jewish book awards, a Jordan Schnitzer book award and another book award. So that's 7 books, 4 book awards. You do the math. Anyway, it's just so wonderful to have you here.
Well, first of all, thank you, Nomi, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank Constance Shan, I don't know if she's still here, but
She's another room.
oh, okay, for arranging everything. She did an amazing job. And Anna Sternschis, I don't know if, oh, okay, there she is, also for being part of the invitation. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, and thank you for coming. I was mentioning that I was watching a soccer game. I don't know if anyone else was. You're missing the end of the United States versus Wales right now, and maybe it's already over. But this is more important than that, to me at least. So I'm going to be talking about Haredi Jews today, or at least a subset of Haredi Jews. And some of you probably know something about it already. For those who don't, the term Haredi is a Hebrew term. It appears in the Tanakh, and it means tremble, as in trembling before God. It is a term that is used by Haredi Jews themselves, although it's not, I would say, the most popular term to refer to themselves. And there are other terms that are used in Yiddish and in Hebrew. There are sub-communities of Haredi Jews. There are Hasidic Jews, there are Litvish, Yeshivish, or Misnagdic Jews. There are Sephardi Jews. Historically, there were German Jews who were an important part of the Haredi movement, and there were Hungarian Jews who were non-Hasidic who were an important part. I'm not going to get into all of those for the purposes of my talk. If I were talking about Israel and the relationship between Haredi Jews and politics in Israel, I would be focusing much more on Sephardi Jews, as well as Ashkenazi Jews, that is, Jews who are coming from Central and Eastern Europe, and Sephardi Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa and the Balkans, in terms of their origin. But I will be focusing on the U.S., and there are two groups in particular, two kind of sub-communities of Haredi Jews are most important for my talk, which are Hasidim and are called Yeshivish or Litvish, Misnagdic. They're kind of three terms that are associated with them. Now, I want to define very quickly, before I get into the kind of meat of my talk, Haredi Judaism. And I have 10 points that I'll make, 10 kind of principles that I think at least provide something of a definition. The first one is that it is a modern movement, so it's modern. That's a historical observation. It starts in the 19th century and in the beginning part of the 20th century. That's where the roots are. But actually, in terms of the movement overall, it's an ongoing process that would really go into the 1980s in terms of the formative period. It's funny because it's kind of a longue durée in terms of a formative period, and that's because certain developments, especially in Israel among Sephardi Jews, are occurring in the 1980s that help to incorporate them into what I would call the Haredi umbrella. So the term Haredi Judaism is really an umbrella term for the groups that I've already mentioned, that have different points of origin. They started in different places. They have many differences between them, but starting in the 19th century, they start to coalesce, as I would argue, into a movement. So the next 9 points help to explain why I think it's a movement, despite their differences and even historical tensions between them. To some degree, they still exist, but they collaborate, as it were, or participate in this movement. So the second point is that it's reactionary. It's reactionary, meaning it reacted against a series of developments. The first one being Reform Judaism. That was already in the first few decades of the 19th century. And it's no accident that the first figures that actually retrospectively were understood to be the founders of the Haredi movement are in Greater Hungary, not what's now Hungary, but Greater Hungary, because that's the borderlands between the German-speaking lands, because Germany as a modern nation state doesn't exist yet, and Eastern Europe. And it's in the German-speaking lands that reform arises. And so it's these rabbinic figures, Moshe Sofer, it's called the Chassam Sofer, he's considered to be the kind of founding figure. By the way, that's another way in which it's like a movement, or it is a movement, I would say, is that there are certain figures who are considered to be founding figures. And he and those around him feel like they have to hold the line between what's going on in the German-speaking lands and the traditional Jewish communities further to the east. Later in the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the Haredi movement is going to coalesce as a reactionary movement around some other developments: socialism, including the Bund, which was the Jewish socialist movement, and Zionism. We could also say that they have a reactionary relationship to secularism as well. Okay, although in fact all of those are quite complicated, but in this, I do think it's accurate to say that a reactionary element is very important for the Haredi movement. Third, It's traditionalist. What do I mean by that? I mean to distinguish traditionalist from traditional, meaning they have a self-conscious relationship to tradition. They do, in fact, maintain many traditions that are very ancient, very old, but they do that in a self-conscious way. They say, we need to hold on to tradition, okay? For example, the Chassam Sofer, this founding figure that I mentioned, he had in traditional Judaism, there's a lot of acronyms. Okay, so one of the acronyms that he articulated was Shalem, that you should hold on to your names. This is an acronym for 3 Hebrew words: your names, your clothing, and your language. Okay, that is a traditionalist move. Plenty of people will continue to speak the languages that their ancestors spoke, or their grandparents, parents, and have the same names and wear the same clothes. But once you say you need to do it, and you need to do it in order to maintain your identity, in my view, you become traditionalist. And that leads to the 4th point, which is that there is ideology. 4th point, which helps to make it a movement, okay? There is an ideology which, again, if you had to come up with, and I'm not the one who came up with this, the notion that this is the most important statement in this ideology, it's also from Moshe Sofer, from the Chassam Sofer, which is the new is forbidden by the Torah. There's a whole history behind that particular phrase. It's actually very, very interesting. It comes from a halachic that is a Jewish legal context. He repurposed it as an ideological statement. It moves from a halachic statement, a legal statement, very particular, actually. And this is also important. He takes a very particular point, which actually narrowly focused, and he makes it into, and he repeated it in multiple places, into an ideological statement. There are other ideological statements as well, but I'll leave it at that. Number 5, authority and leadership. There are distinctive forms of authority and leadership, depending on which subgroup of Haredim. It could be the head of a yeshiva, of a rabbinic academy, a Rosh Yeshiva. It could be a Hasidic Rebbe that is a charismatic leader that belongs to ultimately to dynastic family. It could be the Rishon LeZion, a Sephardi. Ultimately, there'll be a Sephardi figure or somebody coming out of the Sephardi tradition that will claim to have a certain authority in the land of Israel over all the Haredi Jews, in fact. And that's a whole other very interesting aspect of this. There's the Posek Hador. These are legal people who have legal authority. So these different authority figures. Number 6 is patriarchal. All of those authority figures I mentioned, all of those categories, they're all men. Okay, it's not incidental. It's connected to other elements of patriarchy in this society. The gender segregation, the importance of women's modesty, the focus on women's modesty as one of the lines, the most critical lines in the sand, in an ideological sense, and also informing this traditionalist outlook. Okay. Number 7, a relationship to place. That's very important and distinctive. On the one hand, it's global, becomes even more global over time. Initially, it's transnational, it's trans-imperial. There's a lot of movement between, for example, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. Fascinating subject. But then it becomes really global, and it is global now, east-west in terms of Europe, Israel, the US, Canada, but also north-south in terms of the US and Canada and Argentina, for example, where there's a significant Haredi community in Buenos Aires. Institutions are very important. The yeshiva, the Hasidic court, organizations like Machzikei Adas, which is the first Haredi organization, and then Agudas Yisrael, which continues to this day. So institutions are a defining element. Number 9, media. The importance of media. Very early on, Haredim realized that they needed to develop their own media, their own newspapers. Now, this was a broader phenomenon among Jews of various political stripes. Haredim had their own organs, which they could now communicate and compete with socialists and Zionists and others within the Jewish community. And then lastly, so this is number 10, politics. So this will be my entree into the talk, which is that from the beginning, there was a political dimension to the Haredi movement. It was not, to put it in kind of broader history of religion terms, not quietist. Meaning it did not, there are some religious movements which say, we need to avoid involvement in politics because politics is corrupting, for example, right? We get involved and we should separate ourselves. It's too worldly. Haredim did not do that. They involved themselves in politics. They did that in very distinctive ways. One of the ways that is important is that, and it's connected to the ideology, is through the concept of Das Torah, which is this notion that Haredi leaders actually not only have incredible knowledge of the Torah through their learning, but that knowledge enables them, and even to some degree obligates them, to have authority in other realms, including in politics. Okay. Historically speaking, Haredi communities were in fact involved in politics, basically from the beginning, in Austro-Hungary, in interwar Poland, in the newly created state of Israel, where there were Haredi parties, and in the United States, in a distinctive way. Each of these would be distinctive, but the fact that they're involved in politics in all of them is very significant. Okay. All right. I'll say a couple more things in terms of politics, then I'm going to start this PowerPoint. I want to make sure I'm okay on time as well. Okay. What time did I start? About 10 past. Okay. 4:15. Okay, 4:15. Okay, 4:15. Okay. So a couple more while we're doing this, a couple more things. Okay, is this good?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
About politics. Especially in the US context, which I'm going to focus on for the remainder of my talk. One is that local politics are very important. Local politics. And this is relevant for the title here, right? Because Trump, he's a national figure in the US. He's the president of the US, of course. And one of the reasons why this is a distinctive turn of events in terms of Haredi history is because of so much attention was put on a national political figure in the US context. Whereas most of the energy in terms of Haredi involvement in politics in the United States has been on the local level or on the state level, but especially on the local level. What do I mean by local level? I don't just mean like the city of New York. I mean, even more specific to neighborhoods within, to the borough of Brooklyn or to neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Okay, so that's the first thing to note, is that the focus on Trump is distinctive in terms of the attention given to a national figure. So that's one of the things I'm going to be trying to explain. Number two is that Haredi politics in the US has been dominated by certain bread and butter issues. Really a small number of issues. One of them is education, arguably the most important. Right now, it's kind of a third rail in Haredi politics. Why is it a third rail? Because Haredi communities send their children to their own schools, where the modern Haredi, I mean, the whole thing is modern, but even let's say the contemporary Haredi identity and community replicates itself, reproduces itself, I should say, through schools. The schools are tremendously important. You can't, so the anything that affects them, the schools that becomes a lightning rod within the community, including politically speaking. Secondly, government programs, anti-poverty programs, things like housing projects, Section 8, which is a voucher program in the United States that largely replaced housing projects where you get subsidized vouchers to subsidize housing, food stamps, aid to mothers with dependent children, a whole range of things, which starting in the 1960s, Haredim in the United States, and Brooklyn especially, start to make use of these programs. That itself was a political act. It involved the rise, which is another important point here, of a class of activists called Askanim, whose job it was to learn how to apply for these programs and to lobby the government in order to increase the number of community members who could participate in these programs. To some extent, there is a relationship between the Askan and an earlier figure in Jewish history called the Shtadl. And that's a whole fascinating story in its own right, how the continuities and the newness. I would say that the Askan, the way that role, it reflects an aspect of Americanization, in which Haredim in the US took an earlier kind of relationship, and they transformed it into a new figure that reflected the new reality on the ground in the United States, which was, for those of you, some of you may know this, but there was a President Johnson in the 1960s, who developed something called the Great Society, which initiated all of these new programs that would aid poor people. They did not intend Haredim when they developed these programs. They intended Black communities in the inner city and poor white communities in Appalachia. But Haredim made very heavy use from the very beginning of this, largely because of the rise of this activist class. And then lastly, in terms of these local issues, crime. Crime largely because the Haredi communities that settled in the US in the post-war period, so the communities I'm talking about largely settled after the Holocaust in neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Borough Park, which was considered relative to the other neighborhoods, Crown Heights and Williamsburg, which are the other two main, two to three, there's three main ones in Brooklyn. Borough Park was considered much more suburban at the time, had less crime, for example. But in the 60s in particular, crime rates went up in the neighborhoods where Haredim lived, and it became another lightning rod and another area of political focus. Okay, so let me start this presentation. Hopefully this will work. All right, so where did I get the, can I get rid of that?
You can move it around to the
I can move it to the back. I'm trying to move it. I'm trying to quickly. Okay, I got it. Sorry about that. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is a title from, this is a headline from the New York Times. In Democratic stronghold in New York City, Trump finds support among Orthodox Jews. So it's presented as news. Here you see a sign, you can see Trump being spelled out there in Hebrew letters, and a ubiquitous, remember I was talking about the schools? So one of the characteristics in terms of the space, Haredi space, is school buses. This is relevant in terms of a whole range of political issues, not just having to do with school, but for example, bike lanes. Can you have bike lanes in these neighborhoods? Well, one of the main arguments against having bike lanes is because of the school buses, in terms of what the community itself will focus on. Okay, so here's some text from that article. It noted that Trump got 69% of the vote, while Mrs. Clinton got 27, that was them, well, Mrs. Clinton. Mrs. Clinton got 27% of the vote. Now, you should know that that was actually less than previous Republican candidates, presidential candidates. So that is to say that the support in Borough Park for among Haredi Jews in Borough Park has the largest concentration of Haredi Jews in Brooklyn, from a whole variety of different communities, had been going on for a while. So it wasn't like before that they had been voting for Democratic candidates. And sorry, maybe I shouldn't be doing that, going off. I have to stay here, right? And then suddenly they started voting for Trump. No, they had been voting for Republican candidates. And actually, maybe there was a little hesitancy to vote for Trump, initially at least, but he still got much more of the vote. And here are some quotes from people in the community. One of them says, Shia Stern says, "It's like West Virginia, Wyoming, and you're talking the heart of New York City." So to those of you who may not know, West Virginia and Wyoming are states that are very, quote, red, meaning in the US context, that means that they vote Republican, okay? Here's another one, Moshe Steinmetz, a Hasidic Jew who lives in Borough Park, said Borough Park was a red state, even though it was in the heart of a place that is Brooklyn, which overall voted heavily for the Democrats. Now here, before I look at, show you a map, this is from the Pew study. This was a study done of the broader American Jewish community. And just to give a sense of the context for this support for Trump or these other Republican presidential candidates, how does that compare to other Jews in the US who are non-Haredi? So here we have Orthodox Jews, which they didn't break out Haredi and non-Haredi, but Haredi Jews are a majority of this category of Orthodox. Over 60% would be Haredi. 75% of them identified as Republican and 20% identified with the Democratic Party, okay? Compared to, for example, Reform, which is the largest denomination, only 18% identified with Republican, and a full 80% as Democrat. Now, that in itself has been the subject of a lot of study. Why is it that Jews who have been in the United States for multiple generations, who socioeconomically speaking, in some ways resemble groups that otherwise vote, or at least historically did? Now there's actually been some shifts where now people in this socioeconomic educational class actually tend to vote more Democrat, but for a long time people were like, why are Jews voting Democratic? Given their economic status, educational status, etc., you might expect them to vote Republican. So this is a big contrast. You could say that Haredi Jews are outliers within the broader American Jewish community in this regard. Okay, I want to show something that I think is pretty striking. Thank you. Okay, so this is a map that the New York Times created using data from the last two presidential elections. And what's happening here? Okay, it's going to take a little while. Okay, so this will give you a sense of why that. Okay, so this is Brooklyn. This is Queens. It's even more blue. Brooklyn would be. I'm very tempted to go over there, but I guess I can't. Brooklyn would be more like Queens. That is very blue, but there are these little red islands. And one of these little red islands, or not so little, is Borough Park. And here we go. So right here. So you can see Trump, this is from 2020, 87% of the people in this particular precinct, it's called a precinct, in Borough Park voted for Trump. Now the change from 2016, let's see, does it show? Yeah, so Trump went up. And you can basically trace a line, not trace a line, here, this is Crown Heights. This is the site of another significant Haredi community, the Chabad-Lubavitch community. But here it's not quite as red, and that is for two reasons. One is that it is more integrated between Haredi and non-Haredi in that community. And two, because within Chabad-Lubavitch, there are more there's more variety in terms of who people are supporting. One last neighborhood in Brooklyn. This one is Williamsburg. This is called the Hasidic Triangle because of its shape in Williamsburg. Very, very red. Look around it. Okay, I want to show one last thing. We're going to leave Brooklyn. We're going to go northwest. And this is quite an interesting one because it brings up another point that I think is important. Yeah, well, we're not going to Muncie, but okay. Take too much time here. Here we go. Okay, we're going to Kiryas Yol. And actually, so this area here, this is an area where Hasidim in particular from New York City established satellite communities. So they moved out of the city at a certain point, or some of them did, and they established towns where they are, in some cases, pretty much the entire population of the town. Now, the one that is most extreme in this regard is this one, and it's called New Square. And it's where Square Hasidim live. What's significant about this, look at this, 99% voted for Trump. But I want to show you something. It may be unique in the United States. Look at 2016 if you can. 97% voted for Clinton. It completely flipped. It completely flipped. It went from 97% for Clinton to 99% for Trump. Why did that happen? It happened because their Rebbe, their leader, told them to vote for Clinton in the one hand in 2016 for the Democrat, and then for Trump in 2020. And that particular community, more than any other one, the leader has a tremendous amount of authority. In the other communities, they're much larger, and they don't have the leadership doesn't, and it's more split. Like there were some splits between leaders. And so you don't have the same ability of a single leader to kind of direct the vote in that way. But that's an important aspect of any conversation about Haredi and politics, is to what extent do the leaders, are they able to deliver what's called block voting? Voting as a group. Now, in fact, that is a very controversial or complicated question, because part of that question or that issue is the impression that they can deliver block voting. Convincing politicians that you can deliver block voting is a good way of trying to have an impact in an election, even if ultimately you don't. And I'll return to that. I will return to that in a few minutes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So one of the reasons this is significant, it has to do with demographics. Okay. In the United States, 89% of Haredi Jews live in the Northeast. Okay. Most of them are concentrated in the New York City area and others in New Jersey. I haven't talked about Lakewood, New Jersey. If we could have looked at that on the map, that's also very interesting. It's a site of a lot of Haredi communities as well. Now, the fact that they live in New York and New Jersey means a couple of things from a political point of view. One is that in presidential elections, they actually have very little influence and impact, because those states, especially New York, overwhelmingly votes Democratic. That means that even if all of them voted Republican, they would have probably little to no impact swaying it one way or the other. However, because they're so concentrated on a more local level, they can have a much bigger impact on New York City, on Brooklyn, and even sometimes on New York State races. And here you see in New York City, this is already from 2012, but the way in which Haredi Jews, and they use Orthodox here, but the vast majority here are Haredi, are becoming a much more significant segment of the Jewish population and of the city's population. And the future is foretold here, I think, when you look at this last statistic, 74% of all Jewish children in the city are Orthodox. In fact, if the number of Jewish kids who go to Haredi schools in Brooklyn were a public school district, it would be the second biggest public school district in New York State, after New York City and before Buffalo. It's very significant. Here's a map of Jewish Brooklyn. I won't spend too much time on that. Okay, I want to look at a couple of more statistics just to give you a sense of where some of these population trends are going. 14% of the world's Jewish population is Haredi. This is a very recently done survey. Again, if we were talking about Israel, we'd be having a different conversation in a number of ways. In Israel, the percentage of Jews or Haredi is much more significant. 17% of the Jewish population, 13% of the overall population. So that's roughly what it is of the American Jewish community. But of course, Jews in the United States are a tiny, tiny percentage of the overall population, whereas Jews in Israel are a majority. So this means, demographically speaking, it means something quite different. Here are some very interesting figures. Actually, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, by 2040 will likely 40% of the entire Jewish population will be Haredi. So that is probably the most, the place where they will be the largest percentage. And then in 2040, overall global population, almost 1 in 4 Jews will be Haredi. Okay, so we're talking about a very significant segment of the Jewish population, right? What I'm talking about now is important in a number of ways. Okay, now I want to go back a little bit in time just to demonstrate that that some of what happened with Trump was not new. Okay, so here, although it's often presented as new. So here in the 1970s, you see Hasidim flexing political muscle. Well, they had been trying to flex political muscle for a while, but they were doing it again in the 1970s. And here you have some quotes that point to some important issues when it comes to Haredi Jews in politics, which is, notice this quote: "If there is a man who is concerned with the needs of the Jewish community, we will support him. It doesn't mean a thing if he is Black, Jewish, or Spanish, as long as he is sensitive to our needs. In Williamsburg, we supported an Irishman. In Crown Heights, we supported a Black." This is a characteristic of Haredi politics, that as long as a politician can deliver on these bread and butter issues, that politician will get support. And actually, historically, within the US, Haredim have preferred not to support Jewish candidates. They are more suspicious of Jewish candidates. They imagine that Jewish candidates are more likely to discriminate against them than non-Jewish candidates. And that non-Jewish candidates, their relationship with them will be, okay, we'll give you the votes as long as you support our issues. In that sense, it is very much the opposite of, there was a book in the United States by somebody named Thomas Frank called "What's the Matter with Kansas?", where he argued that he chose Kansas as a place where he thought it was an example of a broader phenomenon where communities in the United States would vote against their economic self-interest or their material self-interest in favor of cultural issues. Okay, I would say that historically, overall, Haredi Jews have done the opposite. That is, they have put aside cultural issues and voted for those bread and butter issues. And typically they have seen non-Jewish politicians as being more likely to deliver on that. Here, this is continuation. You see, they give an example of a Jewish candidate who they didn't support, and instead they supported a non-Jewish candidate. And here we also see parochial schools. The single issue for the Hasidic Jews in that race, and this is a quote from the newspaper, were parochial schools. So this is ongoing, goes way back in the US and even before, actually, in interwar Poland, this was an issue as well. Okay, I like this quote because this demonstrates, you were mentioning that in Borough Park back in the day, you remember them being opposed to Nixon. Well, in fact, there was a lot of outreach, and arguably this is the first time that you really see significant outreach from the Republican Party in the presidential level to Orthodox Jews and to Hasidic Jews specifically. And this guy, Ronald Greenwald, was the emissary, and he says, "I'd say reactionary if it wasn't such a dirty word." He's referring to the Haredim. Here he says, "Hasidic Jews see the liberal establishment moving away from traditional moral and political values," he said. They don't care about the root causes of crime. They see that their neighborhood isn't safe. Okay, so crime identifies that as an issue. Then he says, Hasidim are little businessmen who work like dogs 80 hours a week to support families of 7 or 8. They don't believe in welfare or in $1,000 handouts. Now, this was ironic because this was precisely the period that Haredim were mobilizing to get involved, to participate in these government programs. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't working. Basically, the majority of Haredim were what you would call working poor. That is, they did work, but because of the large number of children and because of the expensive cost of living in New York City, many of them were below the poverty line and qualified for this. So it's not that he was right that they are working like dogs, many of them, but they were also happy to participate in these government programs at the same time. Okay, here we see, this is an interesting moment. I actually don't have the original letter, unfortunately, but this is a letter from a number of Orthodox and Hasidic leaders that praise Nixon for his noble efforts in inspiring our country toward a greater commitment of moral values. I don't know how many people know about Nixon, but that turned out to be very ironic. But notice that the focus on moral. That's an interesting thing, because it's not transactional, right? It's about him promoting these moral values. But then we see things that are more in line with what I've been talking about: backing up financial aid to private and parochial schools, stabilizing urban communities, and so on. And here's a nice image, also from the Times, of a activist, a Hasidic activist in Williamsburg, pro-Nixon activist. It notes that he has Presidente Nixon in Spanish on top to appeal to the neighborhood's large Puerto Rican community, Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican community. So he's trying to cover all the bases there. Here's another example of crime being important. Here, this appeared in, I mentioned that media is very important. So the most widely read Jewish newspaper in the world is Der Yid. It's the Satmar, one of the Satmar newspapers, the oldest Satmar newspaper, which they acquire in the 1950s and turn it into an organ for their community. And here we see an ad for a judge that is running for election in 1977 in September. This is significant because September 1977 was right after the Summer of Sam, when you had a serial killer in New York City, very infamous serial killer, and a blackout, that is a power outage that led to a lot of looting, actually right near Williamsburg in Bushwick, it's a neighborhood. So here we see strong on crime. We'll fight anti-Semitism in the courts, the Jew first, and he will hopefully bring back the electric chair. Jail, no bail. Okay. Which is kind of interesting, given there's a debate right now about getting rid of bail in New York City. Okay. This is interesting in light of the quote we saw earlier about the quote handouts. Hasidim lobbied for a decade or so to be designated by the federal government as a disadvantaged minority group. And they succeeded under Reagan, which is also quite interesting. So they, among the only group of Jews in the United States, other Jews are not. Hasidim are designated as a disadvantaged minority group. And here you can see the website to this day. Our clients are business owners, are businesses owned by African Americans, Asian Americans, Hasidic Jews, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, etc. This is the result of lobbying, extensive, ongoing lobbying. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into the current moments and Trump. This is a tweet from Mishpacha magazine, which is a popular magazine among Haredi leaders. It is of a letter that actually was sent in English, so it's in English, to thank Trump for allowing synagogues to remain open during the COVID epidemic. But it was released right before the election to make it seem, some thought anyway, like it was endorsing Trump. in terms of the election. There were a number of very important leaders who signed this. And this shows the shift towards, this is a way of, I think, really signifies the broader shift to Trump. So I want to talk a little bit about why is it that Trump was so appealing to members of these communities. So one thing is that Hasidim and Haredi more broadly could vote their conscience, as it were, because it was a national election. In many of the local elections, they have to be much more careful about who they're supporting because the implications will be immediate and very practical in terms of whether a certain thing gets supported or not by the politician. In Trump, they knew that they could vote what they want, and in a down ballot and more local elections, they could vote for Democrats, for example. Okay. And part of my remarks here are based on conversations with Haredi who I asked, why do you support Trump? One of the things that came across from a number of people was that they said that they felt that Trump saw them, saw their community in a way that no other presidential candidate had ever done, recognized them. But they use the expression, he sees us. How did he see them? Well, a number of people gave, and they weren't the only ones who gave this, but it's broader. For example, he released Rubashkin. His administration released a Hasidic man who was arrested in a scandal around, I won't go into the details of it, but he had been incarcerated in a federal penitentiary. This has become a major issue. This is a whole other subtopic, is activism within the broader Haredi community in the US around sentencing and prison reform. Because in recent decades, a number of Haredi individuals have been sent to prisons. And so they become aware of this. And the fact that this very significant figure, Rubashkin, who for many Haredim was a martyr figure, was released, was seen as recognition of what's important to us. That's just one example of how they were seen. I also think that a significant economic shift that has occurred within the Haredi community in recent years played a role in this, which is the rise of an entrepreneurial class, of a certain kind of entrepreneurial class, which in New York City is dominated by real estate. Shifting away from other kinds of business involvement, garment trades, diamonds, and into real estate. It is no accident that many people involved in real estate, which is a very important segment of the Hasidic economy, especially in Brooklyn, would support another New York real estate guy. Okay. Social media. The consumption of right-wing social media within Haredi communities increased dramatically, even as you had campaigns against access to the internet. Okay, I can talk more about that, but I'm going to move on just for the sake of time. Next slide. Here, this just is an example. I don't know if people know who Andrew Yang is, but he ran for presidential campaign, but he also ran for the mayor of New York. And this is an example of the very sophisticated and directed outreach he did in Hasidic media to a Hasidic audience. Notice he respects our way of life, but then more specifically, education. He was a centrist Democrat. His goal was to appeal to people like Hasidim, as well as to white ethnics who might have otherwise voted for a Republican candidate, but wanted to vote for somebody who actually had a chance of winning, which in this mayoral race was going to be a Democrat. Here we have and it worked in the sense that a lot of Haredi leaders endorsed Yang for mayor. And here we have in Borough Park, actually. They focus on education. But there was another Democratic candidate, Eric Adams, and it split the Haredi vote. So this is also to say that this is not monolithic. Haredi Judaism, despite the fact that you have, I shouldn't say despite the fact, it's because you have these different leaders of different communities that it's decentralized. So within each community, you have a leader who has a lot of authority, but the community next door doesn't consider your leader to have authority. They consider another leader to have authority. So even though there are patterns, because I do think it's a movement in the ways that I talked about, you also have splits. So in this case, this is a Rebbe called the Munkacher Rebbe, and he and others supported Adams, who ended up winning. Okay, I'm going to skip this actually, but this has to do with Lakewood, which is another important site. Here's an image of, I mentioned the anti-internet movement, as it were, within the Haredi movement. And this is a gathering that occurred in a baseball stadium in New York City, where tens of thousands of Hasidim and others, and Haredim more generally, gathered to oppose the internet. Here's an image from a former website, which I like because it shows all the dangers that are facing people. Here's a cell phone. These are graves, and it says different things in Hebrew. My son, why did you learn from me how to surf the iPhone? This one here, and then the iPhone is a 16-year-old daughter who's done all sorts of terrible things that can happen from using the internet. Here's a ad in Der Yid, which compares using the cell phone to Auschwitz. So very hardcore critique. Okay, these are very interesting. If you read the text, it's fascinating. Here's very recent, and this is, I'm going to end the talk in a few minutes, but this is really the entree to the last part of my talk, which is a few weeks ago, the New York Times published the result of a years-long investigation into Haredi schools. The title here says a lot: in Hasidic enclaves, failing private schools flush with public money. This is very controversial within Haredi circles right now, both in terms of the way that it was presented and also what the impact will be and what they can do about it. A lot of activists are very involved right now. That's an understatement, trying to deal with this issue. And it was published, I think, for the first time in Yiddish in the New York Times. So they were trying to, that's an interesting gesture in its own right. What did it mean to publish it in Yiddish? Who was that for? Was it for the Haredim themselves who read Yiddish, or was it for non-Yiddish speaking audiences to maybe indicate, oh, we're being fair, or maybe both? Okay, so this is the last part of my talk. A few days ago, really, there was a race in New York. Not only in New York, but New York State governor. And Hochul is the Democrat. And Samar, which is the biggest Hasidic group in the world, it's split into two. There's two rebbes who compete, they're brothers who compete with one another. And one of them, Aaron, endorsed Hochul for governor. Okay, so a Democrat for governor. And here we have, notice, where is this taking place? Can everyone read that? Samar headquarters. So despite all of those images, the Asifa, the gathering, the Auschwitz is like, cell phone is like Auschwitz, all of that, these Haredi communities have the latest incarnation of the sophisticated use of media is WhatsApp, Twitter, etc. Very, very heavy use, very sophisticated use. So this was being promoted by Haredi, in this case, Satmar, social media. Okay, and here's the nice thing. I was going to vote for Zeldin. Lee Zeldin was the Jewish Republican. He was the other candidate who was going against Hochul. He's Jewish, Republican. They said, I was going to vote for Zeldin because I'm a Republican, but my Rebbe, the Samar Rebbe, said Hochul, and I trust my Rebbe. Now, one of the things that's underlying this is, and we'll see in a second, is that there began to be tension over the support for Trump. And there began to be some anxiety among some of the Haredi leaders that this was undermining their authority. And so this, to me, and I'll talk more about that in a second, this to me was a very concrete way of demonstrating, I was going to do that because I'm a Republican, but no, you know what? Being a Republican, that's nothing compared to being a Chassid. Your primary relationship should be to your Rebbe, not to the Republican Party, and not to Trump. So this was the tension. People were being concerned, like, oh, wait a second, you're voting because you're a Republican? Because of Trump? So by saying you shouldn't do that, and then by having this, you reassert your authority. Anash is another acronym that is a way of some Haredim referring to themselves, Anshe Shalomenu. And here we see them specifically embracing the notion that they are a bloc. Oops, sorry about that. Let's skip this one. So what happened? Hochul won. And now this is what the media started to promote. Hochul calls Satmar Rebbe's wife, thanks her for support. November 9th. Governor Hochul phoned Satmar Rebbe to thank him for support. So this is the demonstration. Look, my Rebbe told me to vote for Hochul. Hochul wins, and now what does Hochul do? She calls the Rebbe, and she calls the Rebbe's wife. So now we have what? We have the inside track. And I asked a Hasidic activist, who's one of the most important activists who's involved in education, I said, what do you think about this? He said, his first response was, it was brilliant. It's brilliant what the Satmar Rebbe did. Because why? He said, he was hedging his bets. If Zeldin won, he was going to support the Hasidim and what they wanted. But if they hadn't supported Hochul and she won, then they wouldn't have such a good relationship. But now that they came out and supported her, now she won. And so they have this relationship, this history of relationship. Okay. And he guessed right. He guessed that she was going to win. Many people towards the end of the race thought that Zeldin was going to win. So that also speaks to Das Torah. He knew that she was going to win, and he bet on the right candidate. Okay, now this is where I'm going to end. This is a very interesting development too. At a speech in front of the yeshiva students so November 10th, this is all unfolding very recently, one day after the other. The Satmar Rebbe, or one of the Satmar Rebbes, he critiqued Trumpism. Said Trumpism brainwashed Yidden. And they tweeted it out. And including the text. The Trumpists have brainwashed, and there's the Yiddish for it, people, and this is painful. This is just an excerpt from the longer speech that I translated here. We must truly acknowledge that this Trumpism, this Goyishkeit, has penetrated, has entered into the Jewish camp. The Jewish camp is another way that Haredim often referred to community, Machane Yisrael. We are in exile, Gullus. This is an important moment in this text. We are in exile. Part of the problem with Trumpism is that to identify with Trump, with a non-Jewish leader, any non-Jewish leader who isn't your own leader or your own Rebbe, and to identify as a Republican, is to forget that you're in exile. We must pay close attention, very close attention. We are not going to fix America. Don't worry about those moral issues. He wasn't saying that Trump isn't right or Republicans aren't right when it comes to a number of the issues that actually continue to bother Haredim. For example, if you talk to Haredim, many of them would say, I'm Republican because I don't like trans rights. Or I have certain attitudes towards taxes, or I think that people are, religion should be in the public sphere. There's a whole range of moral, cultural issues. He's saying, don't fix America. Worry about what's called your Dalet Amos, your 4 cubits. That's what you should be focusing on. Those bread and butter issues, your education, crime, those things. Don't worry about fixing America. We cannot fix America. We are only a small minority. And I'm going to end there.